Welcome everyone to LR Lesson 5, What to Do When You Are Stuck Between the Last Two Answer Choices. So we've all been there before. You're down to the last two answers, and so often, it's not always, but more often than you'd like, you seem to pick the wrong one, and the one that you didn't pick was the right one. And so for any of you who have been following my stuff here, I've already provided a kind of general rule for this scenario before. Most often, one of the answers will sound pretty good, but we'll have one specific thing about it that's a stretch. It's something that requires extra interpretation that's not quite safe to make. That is probably the trap answer. The other answer is probably just weird. There's nothing specifically wrong about it, but you also don't know why it would be correct. Unfortunately, that's probably the correct answer. But we are here today because of this next question. What if it isn't clear-cut? What if both answers look questionable? What if all the answers look questionable? That's what we'll get right into with a couple examples here. So we'll be starting with PT 65, Section 1, Question 20. So breaking down the argument, we begin, as I generally do, with the premises. So premise 1, newspapers generally report on only the dramatic sounding studies. The second premise, newspapers more frequently report on small, unreliable observational studies instead of the large, reliable, randomized ones. So the conclusion is that small observational studies must be more likely to have dramatic findings than large randomized ones do. Because I want this to reflect kind of my process as faithfully and authentically as possible, I did do a second pass through my analysis after I'd kind of figured this stuff out, this breakdown that I just gave you, because I wanted to make some simplifications based on language. So I'm going to start here with premise 1. The word only, anytime you see it, that should set off some alarm bells because it could suggest formal logic, but it also suggests necessity. It's kind of an important logical word. But there's a problem here, and that problem is the word generally. Newspapers generally report on only dramatic sounding studies. But the word generally kind of takes away, I would say, the logical impact of the word only, because they're saying most of the time you stick with this one thing, but most of the time that doesn't cover all the things. So basically, to me, it takes away all the formal logic, the necessity, that strong impact of the word only, and it turns into something like this. The word generally kind of makes this premise 1 into newspapers tend to report dramatic sounding studies. That's it. The only doesn't really have the impact that it used to because we know that's a general thing. It's not a hard and fast rule. Thankfully, the change that I'm going to make to premise 2 isn't going to be nearly as far-reaching as the first one. Newspapers more frequently report on small/unreliable observational studies instead of large/reliable randomized ones. This turns into, because of the phrase more frequently, newspapers tend to report small, unreliable observational studies instead of large, reliable, randomized ones. Again, this is more just a synonym kind of thing, tend to versus more frequently. I just did that so that it matched premise 1. Again, it's not important that you match my particular language. I just like to see things line up whenever possible. I don't think there's anything that I would add to the conclusion or take away from it or otherwise simplify it. I think I'm just going to leave it as it is, and now we'll move into some red, blue, purple analysis. So as I'm usually going to do here on the channel, I will be starting with the premises to find a red concept. So starting with premise number 1, newspapers tend to report dramatic sounding studies. I'm going to highlight dramatic sounding as a red idea. I don't think it's going to be the only one at this point, but that is what stands out to me about this. Because the whole thing is about newspapers reporting stuff, so that's not really going to stand out to me as the idea that we need to be careful of. The newspaper reporting thing kind of runs through the entire argument, but the dramatic sounding thing comes from here. Moving along to premise 2, newspapers tend to report small, unreliable observational studies instead of large, randomized ones. So for me here, I highlighted the small, unreliable observational studies in red because to me, that is a factor that lined up with the dramatic sounding factor that we got in the previous one. The whole set of premises seems to be about what do newspapers like reporting. We hear that they like reporting dramatic sounding studies, and now in this premise we hear that they also like reporting small, unreliable observational studies. So to me, those two factors kind of line up and have a similar sort of importance to what the arguer seems to be concerned about, at least in the premise. So now moving down to our conclusion and hunting for a blue concept. Our conclusion reads, small observational studies must be more likely to have dramatic findings than large randomized ones. Alright, so they're doing something interesting here. So almost this whole thing is a blue concept for me. Small observational studies must be more likely to have dramatic findings than large randomized ones. But logically speaking, what are they actually doing here? To begin having that discussion, let's actually go through my assumption, which is just going to be very simplistic. It's not much of a prephrase at all. But basically, the ideas that we got in red are a correlation. There's a correlation between newspapers liking dramatic sounding studies and small, unreliable observational studies. Those two things just happen at the same time. We don't know if they have a relationship or not. We just know that they're correlated. They were happening. They're both observable in the realm of newspaper reporting. So that red correlation observed in the premises indicates an actual relationship between those two factors. That's what they are assuming here. So again, we move from a correlation in red to some statement of an actual relationship. I don't know if I want to call it causal or not. I don't think it is, but that's why I'm using sort of the more reserved relationship language versus coming out and calling it a causal relationship or a one-way or two-way. I don't know how to characterize it. All I know is that we started in red with a correlation. We had no basis for believing it was anything other than just that, just a correlation. But by the time we get to the conclusion, they're suggesting that there is a relationship of some kind between small observational studies and those studies also having dramatic findings. That is not something that we got in the premises. So that is what I'm seeing as the shift between red and blue here. And that's what has to be addressed in the assumption. So now this gets me thinking a lot about the sort of negative space stuff. It's not so much about what the argument says, but what it has failed to say. We all know, and if you don't, you do now, we all know that mere correlation doesn't prove causation or any other relationship. If you get premises that just show that two things are happening at the same time, that's all that we know. They're happening at the same time. We don't know that they actually share any sort of real relationship aside from that mere correlation, the fact that they are just happening at the same time. And to think about it again from a negative space standpoint, it's not about what the argument does say, but what it doesn't say. There could very well be other explanations why these two factors, the smallness of the study and the dramaticness of the study, there could be other explanations why those two things occur together in reporting, besides there being a direct relationship between smallness and dramaticness. So again, our arguer in the premises clearly identifies two separate factors that are just correlated. We have the premises offer no evidence one way or another to believe that there is anything other than correlation, so they're just correlated. And then they move from a correlation in the premises to a statement of a clear actual relationship between those two things in the conclusion. So red is correlation, blue is a statement of relationship, and the negative space kind of thinking gets us to start being sensitive to the idea that there could be other reasons why the two red factors were appearing together, other than those two red factors actually having a relationship, as the conclusion has so boldly stated. So as I've been doing, even though the text gets a little bit small, bear with me, all of this, armed with all of this, we can now actually go into the answer choices for 20. I think we can get rid of A right off the bat. It casts doubt on the reliability of study by questioning the motives of those reporting it. Nobody cares about reliability. It was all about this kind of correlation in the premises versus an actual relationship with the conclusion. This doesn't really address that whatsoever. I think B, very similarly, we can get rid of immediately. B, in place of reliability, talks about the strength of evidence, but that actually sounds a lot like reliability. Regardless of whether it sounds like it or not, it has the same problem as A. Strength of evidence wasn't something that really mattered to the argument. What matters is this jump between the correlation we get in red versus the declaration of an actual relationship in blue. There's nothing that actually connects those two. Our answer choice has to do that. B utterly fails to do so. C is actually somewhat promising, at least compared to A and B. That's the feeling that I got when I did this. So I give this one a maybe, yes. It confuses a claim about scientific studies as findings sound dramatic with a similar claim about small observational studies. I'm not too keen on all the language of it, but at least it links the correlated factors, and it says the arguer was kind of wrong to do so. So I do like that factor. When I push on to D, this is also interesting. I'm also giving this a maybe, yes, because this one offers an alternative explanation that does fit our negative space concerns. It's not quite as direct as C in touching the correlation in the premises versus the actual relationship that is claimed at the conclusion. It doesn't do that directly, but it does offer an alternative explanation for why these two things might be happening without actually having a relationship between those two things. So yeah, this also survives my elimination, unfortunately. Pushing into E, though, I would eliminate this one because it started off okay by suggesting that there's actually a causal relationship. That's the reverse of the one suggested in the conclusion, which, if that were true, would fit our negative space concerns by saying that the relationship is just not what the conclusion seems to think. But then it brings in reporting as one of the correlated factors instead of the smallness. So really what we're looking for is a reversal of the relationship between dramaticness and smallness. But here they're reversing the relationship between reporting and smallness. So none of the pieces line up for me. E is another elimination. So now we are pitting C versus D. What I want to make clear to you guys is that even though I call these a maybe, yes, anytime I say something is a maybe, that inherently means that I don't actually like it. There's some reason why I didn't pick it. And so this is still very much in the same line of where I started this whole presentation, which kind of invoked the question of what if neither of the answers look pretty good. I had problems with both of them, and now what I'm going to do is actually unpack the problems that I had and see if I think one set of problems for an answer choice is worse than the problems that the other answer choice has. So looking back over C, I think I'm going to actually eliminate it based on these. On second pass, I actually really don't like the term confuses that it has in answer choice C. I mean, I still do like the idea that this answer suggests incorrect to bring the correlated red factors too close together. But really, the arguer isn't in the business of confusing one red factor for the other, which is what answer choice C's wording suggests. To me, the arguer clearly sees them as two separate things whose correlation happens to indicate an actual relationship between those separate things. They never really seem to confuse what is dramatic with what is small and unreliable. That's not their problem. Their problem is saying that these two separate things that they are not confusing, these two separate and distinct ideas are correlated, and that correlation alone is evidence that there actually is some other relationship, some other stronger relationship between those two things. They're not really confusing them for the other. So I would end up selecting D, and I'm not really going to look at it that much more closely. I just know that D fits our concern that other explanations might account for the correlation. And that's the problem that I had with D, is that it kind of came out of left field, but that's the strength of the negative space thinking. It overlooks the possibility that small observational studies are far more common than large randomized trials. Initially, that might sound irrelevant, but with a proper negative space analysis, as long as you have that phrasing in your head, again, you don't even need to do any real analysis, just get this phrase in your head habitually. There might be some other explanation why the two red factors were correlated that doesn't indicate an actual relationship between the dramatic soundingness and the smallness of the study. There could be some other reason, and D does suggest an alternate reason. And this is, again, a reason why I don't suggest wanting to paraphrase everything exactly. Or prephrase, excuse me. I can't imagine anybody would really, or if they do, it's just a lucky guess. How would you guess or prephrase D? You can't, because the negative space tells us that there's a wide range of possibilities. They could have picked anything. They could have picked anything that basically suggested, hey, this is an alternate explanation for why dramatic studies get reported and small unreliable studies get reported. It didn't have to be the frequency of small studies and dramatic studies or anything like that. It just has to bring an extra factor in, and I find that extremely difficult to train in terms of how to know to land on the right one. At best, you have to learn how to prephrase like 3 or 4 different typical possibilities, and to me that's a waste of time. That's not really helpful. So rather than prephrasing specifically, put yourself in a position with negative space to keep your mind open to an unpredicted prephrase that still fits the logic of what you're looking for. And again, the logic of what we were looking for is that there could have been any number of alternative explanations why the two red factors, dramatic sounding and small observational study, why those two things might have been related versus having an actual relationship between the two. D suggests an alternative explanation. And while that's pretty clear in retrospect, honestly, on first pass through, I kind of just accepted that maybe it fits into our negative space, but I didn't really unpack it enough to understand how exactly it would fit. I just thought it was a possibility. I still don't really feel like D is the kind of answer that you'd be like raring at the bit, just like actually just really excited about picking. To me, again, the better opportunity is to find ways to eliminate C. And while I didn't have questions about D outside of its just raw, superficial relevance, because it's something that I didn't prephrase, not something that I predicted. But aside from that, C did have a very specific problem that I didn't really think I could stretch into something workable. It focuses on confusion, and I don't think that's what our arguer was doing, and there's really no way for me to make that case. So because I couldn't make a case for C, but I could see at least some remote possibility of making it for D, that's why I would end up choosing D here. Before moving on to our next example, I do want to admit that this question, the one that we just did, was probably not the greatest example. I did include it simply because I was stuck between C and D for a short time as I was doing this section. For any number of reasons, I could have been moving too fast. Maybe it's just that I got really stuck up on this correlation versus actual relationship logic, but then when I did the negative space, I knew that I was looking for alternate explanations, and I didn't fully accept D as one because, again, I didn't predict it, and it's hard for me personally to accept things that I didn't predict as the right answer right off the bat. So it became a chance for me to model the procedure that I do anyway. So on second pass, I'm always looking for what makes an answer questionable. And what I found is that C had something very specifically questionable that I didn't think I could work with. E was questionable because I didn't predict it, but it did ultimately feel like it violated less of what I was looking for. So my problems with D were much less pronounced than C, and the problems with D felt remediable in some stretch, whereas C, I didn't see that. But I want you to remember the key point. It's not important that you and I actually share the exact same dilemmas. Rather, your focus here should be on how I go about resolving the dilemmas. And again, my procedure is to focus on what I don't like about each answer, each remaining answer, and assessing the level of unworkableness that my issues have for each of those. So again, the level of unworkableness that I detected in C was just too high for me to accept it, so I got rid of it. And the unworkableness for D really came from my ignorance of being unable to predict things exactly and not sort of processing it fast enough to see that, oh, this does fit exactly neatly into the negative space that I was trying to carve out. So now that we've done that, let's move to our second example here, PT65, same exam, but this is from section 4, question 26. It is the last question of the very last section of this exam. So as I generally do, starting our breakdown with the premises, it's pretty simple. We hear that our volleyball team is the best. We get a definition for why that is. It's because the premises tell us that if you get the best people on your team is going to be the best. That happened, so I'm just going to simplify that to our volleyball team is the best. We're not going to question this because this is what our premises tell us. Our team is in fact the best. The second premise, again, is because it's a premise, something we're not going to question. The best volleyball team, that's us, is most likely to win the championship. Okay? Makes sense? So based on those premises, the conclusion is our team is almost certain, Our team is almost certain to win the championship. So now going back on the hunt for some red, blue, purple stuff, looking for a red concept in our premises. We'll start with our volleyball team is the best. I don't really see anything to highlight here because, again, we are given a very clear definition for how to create the best team, and we are told that our team followed that procedure, got the best players, and that by definition, given in the premises, so it's not questionable, by definition, our team is the best. I feel like there's something that we could put in red here for the second premise, though. The best volleyball team is most likely to win the championship. This is where I think our premises begin to attempt making connections to the conclusion. So here, what stands out to me is most likely. So the thing that is, best being the best is not up for question, but most likely to win, that's a probabilistic statement to me, and there's uncertainty there, and so that's why I want to highlight. And so again, I don't actually naturally put in numbers or anything like that. I start, as you guys know if you've been following me, I just start with the plain English. I'm not immediately thinking of probability breakdowns. That's just not how I work, and it's not a suggestion that I make to anybody unless I know that's how they work. So in case you're wondering, behind the red highlight here, I don't have any hypotheticals or numbers set up. I just see that that's the idea that stands out because, again, from premise 1, being the best is not really under question. That's not really an interesting concept to the core logic of the argument as far as I can tell. But the likelihood of winning may be something that could change, or it may be something that has some uncertainty to it. That's why I'm highlighting that here. So now moving into our conclusion to hunt for a blue concept. The conclusion tells us our team is almost certain to win the championship. So again, of all the things here, the championship idea isn't really that important. That's just the context, I think, for this discussion. But really what matters most to me is this almost certain idea. So I'm going to throw that in blue here to contrast with our red, most likely to win idea. And now being armed with this red and blue concept, time to kind of smash them together as best as we can into a purple statement of the assumption. And what I get here is that they are assuming that the team that is most likely to win is also the most almost certain to win. So again, sorry, I keep messing it up because the terminology kind of tongue twists me a little bit. The assumption is that the team most likely to win is also almost certain to win. And so, as I usually should, or at least I should have done here, is some negative space thinking, but I do have a confession to make. When I was doing this entire section, I did the entirety of PT65, but specifically section 4 here, when I did this section, I didn't actually do anything with negative space on this question. I just thought to myself at this point, oh, great, a flawed question that doesn't actually sound totally stupid. I mean, it does sound weird because they're talking about likelihood and then certainty and all that kind of stuff. So I and it's a flawed question, so I know I have to be suspicious of it. But it isn't the worst sounding argument that I've seen. It's not quite as obviously, blatantly wrong as others that I've read. In retrospect, this question I think would have been a lot easier for me if I did do some negative space thinking. But in all honesty, I just set up my general form assumption here. I just linked red to blue, and I kind of left it at that. And really, I don't really have an excuse for it. I have no tactical reason for why I did it. I was just being sloppy. It was the last question of the last section. and I was just ready to be done with the entire practice test. I had spent enough of my day on it. I didn't really feel like doing anything further. I just wanted to get it over with. But again, either way, it's a chance for me to demonstrate. What do you do when you're missing the key insight like I was? Because I didn't do any negative space thinking, I wasn't primed to see the right answer the first time through. How do I actually manage answer choices when I don't know the right thing to look for? How do you catch yourself when you are going into answer choices without any sort of again, I'm not advocating a pre-phrase, but you got to know something. It almost always helps to have some sense of what it is that you're looking for. And that's what this whole negative space thing usually is. But how do I catch myself? How do I choose between the two least bad answers when I didn't really know to be looking for the right thing in the first place? And we will see how that happens on the following slides. So starting with our first pass through the answers on this question, we have our breakdown represented here again. And unfortunately, because I didn't have any negative space analysis, I did not include that in the breakdown just so as to be authentic to how I actually did this one myself. So A was a fairly easy elimination for me. A talks about the arguer is wrong because it presumes, without presenting relevant evidence, that an entity can be distinguished as the best only on the basis of competition. Really, the premises provide a different definition of best, getting the best players, and we're told that our team fulfilled that, so they weren't even basing it on competition. Being the best is about getting the best players. That's clear in the definition. Our team clearly did that. It's not really up for question. B is another fairly easy elimination for me. I'm not sure anything irrelevant was brought in. Everything was in the argument about the best team winning. So it's not like the arguer just kind of pulled in new statements and new ideas out of nowhere to establish their conclusion. If there is something wrong, and there is because it's a flaw question, and it's on LR. If there is something wrong, I don't think it's going to be anything about irrelevance. Okay, C is where I'm faltering a little bit on this question. Finally, I do feel like it's a possibility. I don't like it, but I don't really feel good enough to get rid of it either. So again, the first time I'm faltering. The outcome part of this answer choice lines up because the conclusion is about the outcome of winning the championship. So that lines up. Furthermore, the on the basis of a comparison between the parties also seems like a fairly reasonable stretch, since calling our team the best inherently compares us to the other teams that are in the running. So I'm just going to leave C the way it is and push on to D, hopefully get some couple more eliminations, hopefully both of them if possible. So D I eliminated. The premises tell us that our team is the best because we have the best players, and we don't really question that. Also, D makes it sound like this is a whole to part error, but if anything, there would have been a part to whole error. Again, because each individual person is the best, how do you know that the team is the best? Well, they just tell us that in the premises that is how you get, by definition, the best team. So if there was an error, it would have been a part to whole error, not a whole to part error. We are not improperly assuming that because people are on the best team, that each individual member is also the best. That's what this argument. That is not what this argument is doing. And also, not only is it not whole to part, it's not an error to begin with, because again, this is all in the premises. The premises define being the best team as having the best players, and we got the best players. So we are the best by the definition given the premises, and we're not going to question the premises here. Alright, so E, unfortunately, is still on the board for me as well. Don't really like it, but also can't really get rid of it because it's kind of coming out of left field for me. So it did pique my interest because it suggests a difference between most likely and almost certain, and that is something that I didn't think of, mostly because I wasn't really thinking in negative space. I formulated the assumption, and I didn't really think any further. I was just upset with the exam, how I was feeling, this question, I just didn't really think of it further. But there is something that I didn't like about this, very specifically, which is kind of giving me a lot of pause here. Instead of almost certain, it says more likely than not. I wasn't sure on first pass what to think of this. It would have been nice if instead of more likely than not, it had substituted and used the words of the conclusion, which is almost certain to win. But they didn't do that. They didn't do that. So I was deeply suspicious of this answer. But it did pique my interest because I detected that it was working with both the red and the blue terms in a way that I didn't think of, and so there was a risk of it being the right answer. So we are in the unenviable position of pitting two choices against each other again, as we so often are. So I'm just going to start with C because it's higher up in the list. So on second pass, I am pretty bothered by the word merely. This is a little bit more subtle than perhaps a similar answer choice that we had in question 20 of section 1, where the word confuses bothered me. This is more subtle than that. So the reason why it bothered me is that it is true, in my reading, that the argument really only considers a team being the best and no other factors. So In that sense, merely is not the worst thing to say because whether or not you're the best seems to be the only thing that really matters to our arguer and their premises and their conclusion. So there's that. But I wasn't quite comfortable declaring that nothing else was going on purely because of answer choice E. By the time I got down to E and I noticed, oh, they're talking about something that I maybe should have seen, but I didn't in terms of a potential wedge between most likely to win and almost certain to win. That wasn't really something that I was keyed into. Sure, that was in my assumption, but again, like I said, I didn't really process my assumption. Didn't really think about it. I didn't really do negative space. I had kind of missed it. But E brought back the idea that there might be something else going on other than just who's the best, right? So that's why the word merely bothered me so much on second pass, because I feel like there's a very strong implication that nothing else really mattered or nothing else was going on in the argument, but I'm not comfortable accepting that because of answer choice E. And at this point, my LR experience was also setting off some general alarm bells about C. So while it's true that I didn't have a good handle on the argument at this point, again, my sense that E had a risk of being correct was not a very clear one. I just knew that's why I worded it that way. There was just a risk of me having missed something about the argument that would actually make E work. I didn't actually go back and do the negative space thing quite yet. So still at this stage of my actual analysis, I still didn't have a very good handle on the argument. I did suspect that focusing so much on just the best/comparative factor probably wouldn't work. And that's because of something that I repeatedly mentioned when I was talking about this argument. The best concept really isn't up for contest. Our team is the best, and the best team is most likely to win the championship. Those are premises and they are not up for debate. So I really don't think I can stretch C to make it work because it focuses so much on the best being the problem when it really wasn't a problem. It really isn't central to the logical progression of the argument at all. So the more I thought about it, the less C looked workable. So having all but eliminated C at this point, I'm just going to check E real quick here. So on first pass and even now, I nearly eliminated this one based on it substituting the term almost certain, which is from our conclusion, and instead of using that, they switched to more likely than not. But because of a number, I did refrain from making that superficial judgment call, and of those number of things, the primary reason was I started to see a lot of cracks in C. So yeah, I saw that the word merely I wasn't quite comfortable with that. And also the more I thought about it, C's kind of obsession with the best concept being the problem set off all my LR alarm bells because we're not really questioning that our team is the best. That's part of a premise given definition. And it just didn't seem to be something that mattered ultimately to the logic of the argument. And so because of that, I decided to revisit the argument on behalf of E just to see, okay, did I really miss something? Did I really kind of handicap myself by not doing negative space? So speaking of which, I have some negative space remarks for real this time, not just me admitting that I didn't do it. So as I can see in the assumption that I did manage to come up with, even though I didn't really think about it afterwards, the assumption equates most likely with almost certainly. Because this is an LR argument, and it's a flaw question no less, I have to question that equivalence now. What is the difference, if any, between the concept of most likely and the concept of almost certainly? So I started to do a little bit of hypotheticals here. Most likely could simply mean that I personally have a 2% chance of winning, but maybe 98 other people in the running with me each have a 1% chance. And I just picked those numbers because it all added up to 100%. It doesn't have to, because probabilities don't really work that way, but that's just where my mind went. In that sense, I was able to see that most likely is a relative term. I am simply the most likely to win regardless of my actual absolute probability to win. And here I want to emphasize that coming up with numbers isn't that important. Coming up with a relative idea is what matters more. Most likely simply means you are the most likely. That doesn't tell you how likely you are to win, it's that you are simply the most likely to do so. The most likely thing, the whole point of the numbers here is that there could be a huge range of numbers covered by most likely. Again, all it's telling you is that you are the most likely one to get an outcome, but we don't know how likely you actually are to get that outcome. Almost certain, though, in our conclusion. Almost certain, even though I don't have a number for it, it definitely sounds like close to 100% chance. And because of that, to me, I felt like almost certain is an absolute statement. So like I said, the whole most likely bit is just simply means you are the most likely among everybody else. You have a higher win rate than anybody else. But we don't know what your actual win rate is. While we can still say the same thing for almost certain, we don't know what the actual number is. They do seem to be saying like you have, a pretty good win rate. So it's less relative and more absolute to me, because it sounds like close to 100% chance. If you're almost certain to win, that means you personally have close to 100% chance. This is not really a comparative thing of you being better off than other people, like the most likely term did, so it's not relative in that sense. But to me, the almost certain thing is trying to label you with an actual, this is your chance to win, absolute statement. And as much as I hate it, I have to admit that the answer choices more likely than not language is also an absolute statement. More likely than not simply means majority, right? There's like 51-49. You are more likely to get this outcome than to not get this outcome. That is also an absolute statement. And even though I think more likely than not is very distinct from almost certain, there's at least that absolute link between the two. So looking at it this way, E has at least a shot, however stretchy, however far I have to stretch almost certain to meet more likely than not. That is a stretch to me still. And technically, I think it's a good reason to eliminate this in a different question if we didn't have a better answer. But it has a shot. It has a shot. There is a way that I can stretch almost certain to meet more likely than not and have the answer choice work out. C, the more I look at it at this point, it does not have the same potential to stretch. I really see no way to pretend like the concept of being best is really the only problem with the argument. So that leads me to eliminate C, and that's why I would select E here. I just want to highlight before moving on to some more general remarks that this whole getting really deep into most likely versus almost certain, I want to emphasize that is not something that I instinctively thought to do. Even if I wasn't feeling quite as rushed and exhausted and just ready to be done with PT65, that's just naturally not where my brain goes when I see language like this. I don't think I would have, even under better conditions, really gotten into the most likely versus almost certain difference as deeply as I just did here. The thing that got me into it is because I had two choices left, and there was something that I very clearly understood better about C, and I understood that I didn't like it. I did not like the merely part, and I did not like the fact that it cared so much about the best concept. The merely I was vaguely uncomfortable with because that strongly suggests that nothing else is wrong with the argument, and that's clearly not what's going on. And the more I thought about an obsession with best, the less likely it seemed to be in an LR context to be the thing that mattered. Being the best is something that was very clearly laid out in the premises. Our team clearly met those definitional requirements. So that's not really up for debate. I couldn't possibly be the problem with the conclusion and the premises and everything in between. It couldn't really be that. And so that's what directed me to go after E so hard and so in such great detail, because partially because I just wanted to feel better about picking E, but really, ultimately, on a real test day situation, and actually in practice, I didn't actually feel that great about this relative versus absolute thing that I managed to come up with. It didn't take me that long to do it, but that still doesn't mean that it's worth doing for everybody. I didn't really like it, and it's really more about eliminating C, because technically, like I said, almost certain really sounds like close to 100%, and more likely than not is not close to 100%. It's just at minimum 51-49. It could be close to 100% chance, but it to me covers a much bigger range than almost certain, and it is a distinct term, and so I feel like that's still grounds for eliminating E had there been a better, safer answer. But here, this arguably wrong answer happens to be the least wrong of the 5 choices that I saw. So that's why I'm stuck with doing it. So yeah, I just want to emphasize again, if you're intimidated by the idea of getting into seeing most likely and then seeing that as a relative term, and then seeing almost certain and then seeing that as an absolute term, don't worry about it. That's just something that I think you can just put into your toolkit whenever you're seeing most, some, all, more likely than not. Try to figure out if what you are looking at is a relative versus an absolute judgment, and that may be able to get you to a similar spot. But really, that to me is much less useful and much less important than finding reasons to eliminate C, which I think is much more plain English and has more to do with the actual logic at hand. So that's what I would recommend. Focus more on why I got rid of C versus why E is correct. And again, with an eye towards runtime, I'm not going to do any more specific examples, but there's also a very practical reason why I don't do more examples. It's because you matter more than I do here when it comes to your study. As I frequently mention, you are the one taking your exam, not 7Sage, not me, not LSAT, not any of those other guys. What you get stuck on is what really matters, not what I demonstrate here, not what other students tend to get wrong. Even if nobody else gets it wrong, you're getting it wrong consistently. That's what matters. Forget everybody else. F everybody else. None of those people are taking your exam for you. It's you. So where I'm going with this is that if you try to take some of the insights and the lessons that I provided here, and you're applying them on your own, but they're not really working, and you're down to the last 2, you're in those dilemmas, and the strategies that I'm suggesting aren't working, email me about it. That's very natural because everything that I've demonstrated is just based on my personal experience of the way that I'm wired. And I'm guessing actually, I don't actually have the data for it because I don't know and I don't care. But questions 20 and 26 that we discussed here are probably, they don't feel to me in retrospect like they are the most difficult questions out there. Most of you who are in the scoring ranges that I'm expecting you to be in are probably going to be, or probably actually going to be better off than I was, because the reasons why I struggled with those had entirely to do with kind of sloppiness more than anything else. But all the same, sloppy or not, the consequence of the sloppiness is the same. Let's say on a more difficult question, you were missing the key insight. It doesn't matter why you were missing the key insight. The thing that matters is that you were missing the key insight. So me, I missed it on an easy question because I was sloppy. You on a hard question, it wasn't because you're sloppy, it's because it's hard. But either way, the situation is the same. You are missing a key insight and you're trying to work around that. And that's what this whole thing was about. But again, because everybody's own dilemmas and language sort of variability in our heads is so different and unique, don't worry about you not feeling the same things, the confusion that I did on the exact same things or the exact same language. Your goal should be to try to adapt the flexibility and the approach that I demonstrate to your own dilemmas. And if they're not working, and if you're trying to apply them and they're not working, talk to me about it. Let me know. So if you do reach out to me, I will respond directly to you, whether it be on Reddit, but most people prefer to do it over email, and that's fine. That works better for me too. And if enough of you hit me with similar questions, let's say it's from a newer PT that I haven't really done and something that you guys are all kind of bombarding me about, and that kind of thing does happen. And I gain any new insights that I feel are applicable enough to put out for general consumption, I will upload another video about it. But again, reach out, because that's the difference between why I am able to put up what I do here for free versus why I bill people $100 an hour to do one-on-one tutoring with me, is because the tutoring people all have the same thing. Like, okay, I get what they're saying. I can see how it should work, but my specific dilemmas just don't really seem to neatly fit. Like maybe they're getting currently like a -4 or 5 on LR, and they're getting it down to like a -3 or 4, but they want to push it further. And the filters that I provide here aren't getting them that far. Me working with them for several weeks is basically me taking this stuff and just trying to adapt it, customize it for whatever your particular language tics and problems happen to be. So yeah, reach out to me and we'll kind of work on that. And that brings us to the familiar place of pandering that I always reach at the end. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe, that helps the channel, all the algorithmic stuff. But really, I do want to, again, extend my inbox to you guys. A lot of you have taken advantage of it, and again, I don't really care so much about being engaged in the comments, because YouTube does let me know, but it's not the neatest system for me because I'm not really a full-time content creator or anything. So I'm not really always checking the comments. So reaching out to me via email with specific questions is the way to go. A number of you have taken advantage of that. Some of you have even become my students, which is great. And some of you, it's just been like an easy 30-minute conversation that generates no charges. That's also great. That's kind of why I'm doing this. So reach out, let me know. Everything that we talk about is going to help me as an instructor, and it's going to help both you and also the rest of your peers who are studying as well in future for all of posterity. So yeah, I would like to kind of again formally extend an invitation to reach out to me if you're trying anything and it's not working. That's specifically the kind of thing that I'm most interested in hearing about. All right, I will see you guys in the next one.